Hello and welcome to the Real
Okay.
Drunk Show. Today's show is called Theology in Protest, and Courtney and Verdell are joining me today to discuss what God, the Bible, and like sacred stuff says about protesting. Let's introduce ourselves first. Courtney, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Courtney. I am I guess what do you want me to introduce? I'm here in the Chicago suburbs area. I am a Baptist preacher, and I guess that's about all there is to know.
Alrighty. Courtney, a Baptist preacher from Chicago. What you drinking on?
I am drinking a Cadillac margarita,
Ooh.
and it's
And
a really big one. So it's I call this one an Escalade.
I love it. How are you doing, Courtney?
I'm doing
Let's
okay. It feels really weird to say I'm doing okay. But considering everything that's happening, but also considering the fact that, I'm home, I'm safe. Um, and even though all this stuff is going on around, I know that, there's something to hold on to, some sort of hope, even though things are kind of crazy right now. But for the most part, I'm handling it all right. Yeah.
righty. Verdell, welcome back.
I know it's been so long since I've been here.
After Verdell left last week, one of my friends texted me and she was like, a fucking amazing 2.5 hour conversation. He is brilliant. I was like, I know we weren't supposed to be on that long, but he's just so good. Tell us about
Oh, well,
yourself,
sometimes it just works out that way. So, about me, I am a Jersey Shore boy who is in the DC area. I am a graduate of Howard University School of Divinity and Western Theological Seminary. I am, as I talked about for, I guess, over 120 minutes last week, a former, well, I was a minister in a lot of denominations. The list is kind of long. I don't know what that says. But I'm a former Baptist Methodist mainliner, non-denominational, yes, all of that.
Okay.
But these
All right.
degrees will still.
And once you pay for it, you got to use it, right?
Yes, I pay for this.
So there's a slight delay in the audio, guys, but we're gonna get through this. We are here today because people have been using God as an excuse not to speak out in the protests that are going around for the dignity of Black lives. And we're going to ground today in conversation in a tweet from the Simone, who said, I am not living to please man. I am here to please God. At the end of the day, I am a Christian, all caps, exclamation point. I'm God fearing and I have to answer to him, exclamation point. I'm going to ask myself, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Not what would an angry Black woman do. I am angry. I am also trying to be godly. So, my first question for you all, how different is what would Jesus do from what would an angry Black woman do?
Those the Venn diagram of what Jesus would do and what an angry Black woman would do is like probably really close to a circle. So I mean, if we're telling the truth, it's probably a circle, right? So I mean, I don't understand the distinction. Also, like, just not even to go into too much of. There are so many problems with her tweet, including the all caps him. Like, so honestly, let's yeah, but circle.
Verdell.
I just think it's interesting how like you could dissect this tweet and write a dissertation about it, honestly, because it's a showcase of just how, and I think we talked a little bit about this last week, how for people who aren't like us, right, which is most Christians,
Mm,
their Christianity is very gendered and very racialized in
mm,
these particular ways. And so the angry black woman, she pulled it from somewhere. She pulled
mm.
that stereotype, the fact that you phrase it, she pulled it from somewhere. And the fact that, God is a man and not human beings, but man and him and all of this. And so thing I can't see thinks about me. And like to the erasure of her own self. And so I think you just have a lot of what people typically believe, people who don't go to seminaries and read theology books and things like that. This is pretty close to what their Christianity often is. So as jarring as it is to us, and we're like, oh no, 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 a lot of people will be like, amen. You know what I mean?
So this is really interesting because we talk about how God is in us, but she has created this like really big dichotomy between her as an angry black woman and what Jesus would do. What does this do for your spirituality when you are so separated from God? Like who you are is so different. Like you see yourself in such a negative view that God can't live in your anger.
Yeah, and so honestly, so that is actually one of the things that we as American Christians really do wrong, especially Black American Christians. When you look at, traditional African religions, there wasn't this separation of what's sacred and what's secular. Like everything living is sacred, life is sacred. Jesus came and was embodied in flesh and lived a fleshly experience and experienced every single emotion that we like that is. And so if like to separate what the human experience from what would is possible in the realm of what is godly is just this messed up weird westernized thing, and it comes from the denial of flesh as ungood, as bad, as
Mm.
dirty, and specifically black flesh. You notice that she didn't say I'm not an angry woman or I'm not an angry person. She said I'm an angry black woman. And so not only was it racialized and genderized, but it was very specifically a denial of um black womanly flesh as being bad, whereas this white male Jesus that she, because there's no way to have that the picture of God and of Jesus that she has without it being white, right? Like if you
Mm.
have the male God, it's a white male God. Nobody's thinking a black male God unless you're Morgan Freeman and you making bank
Mm.
with Jim
Uh-huh.
Carrey somewhere. But in general, when people who think of God as a him are thinking of God as a white him, and so it's a denial of the black woman's experience as being valid, as
Mhm.
being anything that's good. It's something, it has to be separate from what is God. And so then we have to work to be something other than black women to be godly.
So this is interesting because this denial of flesh as good is something that keeps coming up as a stumbling block in our ability to live full whole lives. Like we've been having these theology in conversations. We did the theology in the Players Club, the theology in Waiting to Exhale, and it seems like each week, like when we're talking about each week in general, but all of these conversations have really been grounded in black womanhood, and so that allowed us to get into like black sexuality as well. And each time it is our belief, our American Christian belief, which is very different from, like you said, African spirituality, that has taught us that our flesh is bad. And last week Allison brought up brought this up and said, like, if God came to this earth in flesh, what makes us, why do we see flesh as so bad? God wrapped himself in flesh and came to earth. And so we have a lot of unlearning to do around that. Courtney, what is protest?
What is protest? Oh my goodness. I don't know if I have a real definition of protest outside of, I mean, so there's obviously, we have an establishment, and protest is, standing against that established order, whether right or wrong, something that comes against what is established as being held up as the norm. Yeah, I guess that's what protest is. And it's done in such a way that is loud and attention getting and disruptive, right? Like standing against the norm and standing against the norm silently on your own. It's not, you can protest silently, you can have your own like separate thing, but if you don't disrupt something, it's useless. So why?
So protest is disruptive. Verdell, I want to do two things. I want you to tell us what protest is, but I also want you to I want to step back and revisit this B. Simone tweet first. How she created this like large dichotomy between herself as a Black woman and God.
Mm-hmm.
How is that problematic? How does that create a barrier for us to live our full lives? And like, is that healthy spirituality?
Well, I would say no, it's not. My view of a healthy spirituality is anything that helps you get more in touch with yourself and other people. That's what a healthy spirituality is, whether it's one with a God in it or not. I would not. B. Simone is pulling from a long tradition of that sort of belief and faith. So it's one that she didn't come up with herself. It's something that I'm sure if we talk to any of our aunties and grandmas and moms, they would say similar things in some way, shape, or form. It's not me. I must decrease so he can increase, and not I have to go back so God can be seen. It's like you don't really matter. You just have to plunge through. And while theologically, yes, I do disagree with that. I think also, in particular, when you're talking about Black people, particularly Black women, for so long, their personhood has just been ignored, and they've just had just to kind of push through. And so it's kind of a way of kind of like a theological judo, or more accurately Aikido in a way. It's like, this is the way the world is anyway. The world negates me anyway, so let me lean into it to maybe some type of spiritual or heavenly benefit. And yeah, I do think you basically are deleting yourself. You don't matter, you don't count. Your anger doesn't count. Your feelings don't count, because and again, you're being held accountable to a standard that is unfair to you. And no matter what type of indignity you have to experience, you have to somehow make your God happy with you. You know what I mean? In some shape or form. And again, I think it's important to keep saying this is what a lot of people think and believe. This is how a lot of people feel. This is I use the word typical not in a derogatory way, but that's typical Christianity for a lot of our folks. That's just all they have access to.
That's funny because the response to the tweet was like, you get online and talk about sucking dick every week, but now that it's time to protest, you can't do anything. And my response was, get you a spirituality that allows you to do both. To like protest and talk about sucking dick. And someone told me, kid, get out of here with your progressive Christianity. Everyone doesn't get that. So I think that's important for you to keep saying, like, she isn't like a one-offer. A lot of people believe this way.
Yeah, you're taught to compartmentalize yourself. Like the way that she can do it so easily is what so many people like. That's what that Christianity, particularly that type of Christianity, teaches you to do. You're in boxes, and so you find a way to separate yourself. So that way, it's like having your food on a plate, so that way it doesn't touch. So that way you can't mix it all together. And so it's this other part of like you compartmentalize, and so that's how you never rationalize, you never make sense of it. It's just you keep them separate. And so to her and people who in those type of situations, it probably isn't the the contradiction is not obvious because they're so far away from each other in her mind. They're not allowed to kind of interact with one another. She doesn't have the idea of a God that would be like, hey, your body is good, use it, and hey, you don't have to die in the street by a police officer. You can like say you're mad about that. Like that just isn't, she doesn't have a conception of that.
So, Verdell, next other question. What is protest?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think protest is just basically, it's such a big definition. I think just protesting is well, I think it goes back to, to loop it back into Christianity, like most of us are Protestant Christians, protesting. Basically saying, this is wrong, do this instead. Or at the very least, this is wrong, and like somehow, either verbally, physically, or both, expressing that a perceived action or situation is not to your liking. And that can be big or small.
So I think we can all agree, like, it is not wrong for Christians to protest, correct?
Correct. So honestly, so this whole dichotomy of, you know, Christian, so I've been told in preaching in sermons, just stick with Jesus, preach the gospel, leave all that politics alone. And you can't have people who think that there is a separation of gospel and politics don't understand politics, or they don't understand gospel. There is no gospel without politics. Jesus came and started a socio-political movement, and that is why he was killed. I mean, Jesus, one of the best sermon series I've ever heard on the matter was by Howard John Wesley, and his series was Enemy of the State, and it was like 4 or 5 part series. But in it, he said Jesus died for our sins, but he was killed for something else.
Interesting. Verdell, do you want to get in on that?
I agree. I think that, and to be fair, a lot of this you wouldn't know if you went to like some fancy, expensive school and read lots of dusty books. But the gospel, like literally the gospel itself, it's filled with political terms, like even terms like evangelical and things like that. So I'll explain it. So you know how it says, like, you know, the angels came and proclaimed that, you know, there was the Son of God was born or whatever, and that, you know, and the Prince of Peace, and they sent heralds all around to say that he was born, and people came and brought him gifts and all of those things, and the words, you know, the good news that the Savior's been born, and all of that. Those are the same exact words they use for the Roman emperor. And so the intention is to demonstrate that Christ was king and not Caesar, not the Roman emperor. That was the point. And so anybody at the time reading this would instantly say, it's like saying, if I were to say, you know, when I was born, the Chief Justice of the United States came to my house and put my little teeny hand on the Bible and said, repeat it after me. I, Verdell Anthony Wright, promise to uphold the Constitution of the United States, whatever. That is, it sounds outrageous, but to the people of the time, they very much, as Roman conquered subjects, would have understood the imagery and that they were evoking. It was basically saying, no. Because the whole idea was that the Roman emperor was the Son of God, chosen to bring peace throughout the world and all this other stuff. And so the whole idea was to say, no. It's actually Jesus. Jesus is the one who brings this about. And so it's inherently political. Like, you cannot do that. And when people say political, what they mean is, I don't want to talk about what they said on MSNBC. You know, that's what they mean, but it's a very small idea of a political, like anytime you have people, you have politics. That's it. Like, you really can avoid it. And there are lots of ways to define politics, but politics is just, you know, people debating on how to use limited resources. And that's one definition that I like. It's like, how do we use stuff amongst everybody else? You know,
Mm.
like whether it's material, mental, whatever, like just how do we use our stuff amongst each other? You know, that's politics. And if you exist, unless you live in the woods by yourself, and even that's a political statement, like that's, you know, so it's like you can't separate. It's one thing if like you don't vote and don't want to go to the city hall or whatever, but that doesn't mean that you're not political. That in and of itself is a political stance.
Yeah. So it is, and I think it's really interesting that you said that because people talk a lot about divesting from systems, and they think that withholding one single like a individual person, I'm not going to vote because I don't like these candidates, so I'm divesting from this system. Um, they use it as a protest, like so kind of, but even that is it's a political stance, but two, it's you can only divest from a system so much when it touches every aspect of your life. Just because you choose not to participate in it doesn't mean you're not participating in it. Non-participation is a form of participation. Is really kind of where I like that. I like that. I like you said that.
So throughout our religious tradition, there has been protests, correct? Do
Mm-hmm.
you all have like a favorite example with the people of protest that has occurred in the Christian tradition? And no, it's not our tradition, but the Christian tradition.
When you say favorite, is that like tongue in cheek?
One that okay, so I use favorite like this. One of my favorite Bible stories is when the bear comes out the woods and attacks the
Yes,
42 kids.
because he
Who
called him
were
bald.
because they called the prophet baldhead. Like that
Yeah,
is
he
one of
was
my
bald.
favorite. And I really wish God would like God doesn't use bears the way he used to, and that disappoints me.
I
I
know, if
need
only.
I need God to, put more energy in the bear. Yeah, that's what I mean by favorite. It's that one that sticks with you no matter what. Like it's first that come to mind.
That's a good one. I like the flood.
Ooh. Oh,
I
say
mean,
more. Say
you don't
more.
get you don't get more control alt delete than the flood, honestly. Personally, so it's just
Oh.
it's looking like it's just thinking like you writing a paper or something for school. And you're like, look, this is trash. There's no way to messing this, and you just hit the button, and you might save like look, these one or two paragraphs are good, but the rest has to get deleted, and that's basically what the flood is. And it's so funny to me. And then at the end, it's just like, all right, so that's over. And so here's a rainbow to let you know that I won't do it this way again. Not saying that might not destroy you all again, but I won't do it like this again.
But you know what? I really love the flood example because it does something, right? Everything is destroyed, but after that, it's built back up. Right. And that is a really important part of protest. You have to know what you want, or at least some idea. It can't just be standing against something. You have to also stand for something. And so tear it down. Yeah. Burn it down. Great. But what are you planning to build in its place?
You know what?
So I like the flood. I like the flood.
That
God
is
protesting God the world.
that's something that I have had to learn because I'm really good at coming through and flipping over tables. I can tear shit up all day long. But when you're tearing stuff up, you always also have to leave people with something. Um you can't come like from a theological perspective, you can't really come and tear people's theology apart if you're not giving them something else to form their world around. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree in a particular parameter.
okay?
That's what I would say. I generally agree, and this is coming from somebody who has been in leadership in various capacities. That in my view, someone like me, I need to have. Okay, so we're not doing this. So what are we doing? Cool. But I don't think that somebody's at work and they're like, look, I hate this. This sucks. I personally do not always put the onus on someone to have a better plan if they complain, because
Mm,
the injustice is just enough. It's like, hey, ow, this hurts. But what do you want to happen instead? I want you to stop hurting me. I don't care how
mhm,
you do it, just stop. And I think that while I do think that, yes, if we're going to build stuff, if we're going to, what are we going to build in this space is an important and necessary conversation. I also think that if one isn't careful, that is often what's used to douse out people's flames. Even to the extent where it's like, okay, they literally are telling you what they want, and maybe it's they're not on the payroll. Maybe it's your job to figure out how to fix it. If you were elected, like, you know, you told people they said that they were dumb for not voting, and now they're looking at you because you won. You need to fix it. That's why you're there. They don't have to. It's
mhm,
your job to have the plan and the meeting and the panel. And so I think it's important to kind of have both of those there,
mhm.
Mhm.
just for that tension. I think it's important.
Yeah, yeah, nuance. I love it. Nuance. Something that is so lost on people, honestly, and that's why we having these conversations is so hard with the general populace because people don't understand nuance. Like that's one of the things. It's just, and that's if we could understand nuance, the rest of this would be easy.
Mhm, mhm.
Nobody is asking for too much, and so if we just understood nuance, honestly, so much could happen.
So, we've been talking a lot about text and not sacred texts that are just scripture, but like we had this whole conversation about like what are your sacred texts that are not Bible. So, with the understanding of sacred texts as like text that grounds you in your practices, what are your sacred texts when it comes to protest?
Ooh.
Ooh.
I
So
will
I'm sitting
just
here
say that.
looking at a stack of books. Oh, go ahead, Kia. Go ahead.
Oh, well, while y'all were thinking, I was just going to share like one of mine that comes from scripture that I like ground my theology and my social justice work from is Micah 6:8, which he has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Like, that is the lens that I filter all of my like when I'm trying to make a decision, that is what I filter it through. When I think about books, there's a whole stack, like y'all said. What are some of your
um, yeah, so if we're talking scripture wise, I have a few, right? There's Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking about what you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And then I always start with where Jesus started, right? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I've come to bring good news to the poor. I've come to set the captive free, come to declare the year of Jubilee or the Lord's favor, depending on what translation you're looking at. But and this is actually another important thing about I spent so many times, like so much of my life, hearing that passage and not understanding what the year of Jubilee was, because it's a word that means something. It's coded, and it helps no one if you don't understand the code. The year of debt relief. Jesus was for student loan forgiveness. Okay, y'all. Um, but so so that one is important to me if we're talking biblical text. And then of course the one you just pointed out. But then also if we're talking with outside of the biblical text, I have so many that because it's important and it's important to have text outside of the biblical canon that we lift up as something that has shaped our thought, shaped our thinking, shaped our consciousness about what it means to be human and to live in community with other people, and also what it means to live in relationship with God and with the earth, because all of those are important and part of what it means to be Christian. Um, and one of them though is Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper. Is she touches on some of everything, and it just when I read that book, something just clicked, like not because it was new information or not because it was something I had never thought before, but because it was just written right there, and it was just like, oh, this is this is, I'm not the only one that thinks this is, but also it was just written and just outlined in such a way that it was clear. It just made so much sense, and I go back to that book regularly when I'm looking for some sort of inspiration or just like wanting to think about something in a different way. Also, Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman is one of my all-time go-tos. The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, and then Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God by Kelly Brown Douglas. so I I mean, there are, and I know some of these books are very like, they're academic texts, they're harder to read, but Jesus and the Disinherited is really accessible. Anybody can kind of digest that. And then also James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, is also one of those. It's a concise text, but it gives you everything you need.
Verdell.
So when I was a Christian, I would say probably something like Amos, where
Yeah.
and not the part that one of my favorite things to do with books and things is that it's always a part that everyone knows, but then it's something like right after it that people like don't even look at, that puts it into context, and it's like, wait, so you're missing the point. And in that same thing where it's all about like rivers for like a stream or whatever, God is also like, I'm not coming to your festivals. Like, I don't care about any of your stuff because you're not treating everybody right. I'm paraphrasing. And so he's basically like, I'm not coming to church. All the things that I told you that you're supposed to do, all the festivals and feasts, none of it matters because you're not treating people right, so I'm not coming. And I always liked that. I mean, particularly where I am now. I took him up on what he said. But I always found that interesting because there's always some way that it flips the script. It's like, well, no, this doesn't really matter if people aren't being treated right. None of it really matters. But I would say that even for me now, while I don't ascribe like divine meaning from it, I think Jesus in the temple, issues with the temple are very important to me. Particularly the things that he did in that he, healed people and did not charge them for it, which was a very big deal. Which is, again, it's no one debated whether or not Messiah was very heavily debated, but people refer to him. I guess we refer to like what we call like an exorcist or a wonder worker, because people thought that if you got sick, then you had demons. And so no one disputed that that's what he was considered as and was functioned as, even people who didn't like him. But the difference is that he did not charge people. The woman with the issue of blood, the reason why her account is unique is that she said that she was broke because she went to all the other people. And that's because she went to all the other folks who she paid to have them try to heal her, and they couldn't. And so Jesus was her last hope. And so
wait, Verdell, wait. Oh. So the woman with the issue of blood was out here paying people to heal her, and they were failing. Spent all this money trying to get something that no one could give her.
And she was desperate, so she broke every law possible. She was bleeding, which meant that she was ritually unclean, and she was a woman dragging through all these people just because this, as much as, yes, the hem of the garment and like the theology behind it, but also Jesus ministered mostly around poor people until the very end of his life. And so that's why his crowds were so big. It's like, look, this guy is healing people. This guy and his folks are healing people, and they're not asking for money. And so poor people don't have money, and they often are pretty like the typical person in that time. If you weren't like living where Jesus lived, like, you lived like maybe 50-ish or so. But if you were living where Jesus was, 30 is like, wow, what a wonder. You made it. You know what I
That
mean?
is very interesting. We like to say like Jesus lived till he was 33 and like that was such a short life. But when you think about like the life expectancy of people in that age, oh,
Jesus was probably short compared to us. He stank. He likely had a couple of abscesses in his teeth because, he was probably malnourished. He probably couldn't read, except maybe like a few signs here or there. He was very eloquent, clearly, and very powerful speaker, clearly. And
uh-huh.
he was not schooled in the ways even of the time that people of a certain class were schooled, but that didn't separate from his passion um and his drive. I think that's important to highlight. I think even in Acts, Jesus, like the disciples, one of the people are like, "Oh, we can tell by the way you talk where you're from." And so it's like, hearing somebody and saying, "Oh, well, you're from DC or you're from Atlanta or I can tell you're not from here." This so
Mm,
and because I can hear where you're probably from, and I'm assuming that you're stupid type of thing.
mm,
And so that's why I think all those points are really important because it just shows you how people still kind of think in similar ways today and how those things pop out. But for me, I think I'm looking at other texts now that help ground me in why protest matters to me. I think one good text is by James Foreman called "The Making of Black Revolutionaries." It's
mm,
kind of long, but he
mhm,
details his journey, and I think, at least from my perspective, it's good because he puts a couple of chapters in there that discusses how he tried to work in the church and within the church, and then ultimately, after reflection and thinking, realized that he didn't believe anymore and decided to leave. And so I think it's important to highlight um, that you know the Black freedom movement is an expansive movement, and that people always engaged it in different ways. That much, while there are some things that are new, it's not as much as people might think. And that these old ways of thinking existed before that. If you have a thought or a feeling, there was probably a lot of somebodies who felt like you did, and there's probably a bunch of somebodies who wrote it down, and even some people who you may not even realize. And so some famous folks like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, just the way that they protested, not just the injustice that they suffered, but also the way that they wanted to be themselves and have their own minds and their own thoughts. And so I think it's important just to even if you don't follow along with everyone,
mhm.
see that there always was a diversity of thought amongst Black people, and that thinking differently and new. This isn't some like newfangled thing. That you always had diversity of opinions about things, and if you're saying something today, if you look hard enough, you will find a bunch of people who probably said the same thing, probably a little bit better.
I always look for people who say what I'm thinking in a way that is much better than I ever could. Um, so what should we be doing now in this moment? I've seen a lot of people say, like, if you ever ask yourself what you would do in the 60s, if you ever ask yourself what role you would play in the revolution, now is the time to do what that answer would be. What do you guys think we should be doing in this moment?
That's such a hard question and to ask and to answer. I guess it's an easy question to ask because you just asked it. It's a hard question to answer, especially because one, I mean, so there are a lot of people who say if you're not out in the street marching, you ain't doing nothing.
Mhm.
And I want to unequivocally say right now that that is completely false. Um, and before we even get into what we should be doing, one, I don't know if there is a should other than
Mhm.
something, right? Um, you if you're doing nothing, you're like if you've chosen to stay silent, you were choosing the side of the oppressor. So if you're doing nothing, then you wrong. Period. That's the only thing we should not do is nothing, other than of course be actively like engaged in oppression. But So don't be actively engaged in oppression. Don't be silent. Don't do nothing. But outside of that, I think there are so many different ways of engaging with what needs to be done, because work really does need to be done on multiple different levels. And there are so many ways that certain people can or cannot engage, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. Everybody can't be out in the street because somebody out there has COVID and doesn't know it. And your sister that's going through chemo right now shouldn't be out there next to them, because she's gonna die needlessly for the struggle. And not that people aren't going to die. We're obviously we're seeing this uprising because someone died, right? And not that he should have died for the struggle, and not that his death is redemptive in any type of way, because it's not. I don't want to get that confused either. But we also don't need to be taking unnecessary risks, right? We have to take risks. To protest is it inherently embodies risk, but we don't need to take unnecessary risks, whether that's health, whether that's losing your job, if you know that that's the only way you can provide for your family. But there's always something we can do. If it's pushing, like, for if it's pushing your family members who are saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or doing nothing, or kind of like out there putting these hug the police things on Facebook. If you say don't hug the police, like, you doing, like, getting people to think differently. Think about who you have influence over and who will listen to you. Who can you reach and in what ways? Everybody doesn't need to be in the street, but there's somebody that only you can reach and only the way you can do it. And so if you do that, if everybody does what they can, then we're all working towards that common goal.
Thank you, Courtney. Verdell?
I would say, in line with Courtney, I would say if you feel the urging that you want to do something, I would say to do a risk assessment just to see what's important to you and who relies on you. I mean, I'm pretty sure you can look. This is what organizers and activists do all the time before they engage in actions, just to look to see, okay, well, who can do what? Who can afford to get arrested? Who can't? Who can be on the front lines? Who needs to do the water? And all of it matters. All of it is
Right.
important. And so, but it's no need, if the point isn't to put yourself needlessly in. There is a risk, but to assess what level of risk makes sense for you. If you are the primary breadwinner of your family, being in jail wouldn't be the best thing. You know what I mean? Things like that. So I guess use myself as an example. I'm asthmatic and I'm diabetic, which means I'm on medications. Being in jail for several days would not work well for me. So I tend to avoid protest. Also, just that because at some point I'd probably get too angry, and it wouldn't work. So I tend to do that. But just also, I would urge people to look locally, like to see what's around you. What's around you. Even something. There isn't anything too small. There is no one hero, one savior, which is something that I think that in this modern times we're thankfully beginning to move away from. It's like there isn't just one person needs to be the hero. It's that, hey, this day, I'm not going to get a cheeseburger today. I'm going to donate my money to this local thing, or I'm going to go to a meeting, or it's just like the bigger picture. Yes, there are these things that are very acute that are happening and that are the catalyst for what's happening right now. But the bigger backdrop is that we live in a society that prioritizes certain types of people and certain types of things over others. And so wherever you can work to undo that, whether it's big or small, that's what you can do. If you don't have millions of dollars and you got to pay your rent, then that means, maybe giving money isn't the thing that you can do. But if you can sit on a board, if you can go to a meeting, or what can you do? Maybe it's still a sacrifice or something that you can make that would not put you in harm's way. Maybe it's a sacrifice of, okay, instead of going to the gym, I'm going to go to the PTA meeting because there's nobody representing Black people there. I have to get into school. Something like that. Just think about those types of things. And I would also say, if nothing else, what you can also really do is educate yourself. Really
Mm.
learn about why things are happening. Like, yes, help, but try to understand. And you don't have to understand every issue. You don't. I'm not one that gets mad at people if they don't necessarily say things about a situation that they don't know anything about. It's easier to deal with your silence than you saying something wrong. I'd rather you just not say anything right now so you know better, which is fine. But whatever issue is that you have the most influence over, that you can impact the most with the best outcome, really do your research, really understand, so that way you can talk about it, so that way you get it. There's no waste in that, because I think that one thing that's often lacking is that people being able to understand what's happening, and it's a lot, it's complicated, so it's not like it's not easy, but it's really worth the effort if a situation or topic matters to you, particularly pertaining to things that we're talking about, to educate yourself on the history, on the issues, what's been going on with it, so that way you can effectively help.
Thank you. One thing, so I like to the way I look at this, like the modern movement for Black lives, for me, really kind of began with the Gina Six. That was one of the first times in my lifetime that I saw digital organizing specifically be used to organize around a group of Black people who were suffering from an injustice with law enforcement. And then we saw it again with Trayvon Martin. And then you have Mike Brown. Like these are the big events in the beginning of this current movement that stand out in my mind. What the protests looked like then and what they look like now are very different, not just in intensity, but even in the diversity of the crowds. What does that tell us about where we are in this moment?
Ooh.
Well, I was trying to let Courtney go first because I just finished talking. I didn't answer. I was talking last. I didn't want to. I don't want to harm.
Oh, is that why? Is that why?
I mean, I can go. I have something to say. I just don't want to.
Yeah, no. I think so. I do think that I don't, and I want to try and capture the nuance here because I've experienced racist, white supremacist, very young people, like 16-year-olds driving past me while I'm getting them out of a car with my son yelling white power, like kids. So I don't want to say that it's getting less prevalent, but I do think that as we have become a more connected society, people are exposed more to people and ideas that are outside of what even people who were coming into teenage years and adulthood 5 years ago were experiencing. As we become more global, as we were more connected on the internet, right? The young people, really young people, have always had the internet, right? My son has a cell phone and he's 8. I didn't get my first cell phone until I went to college. There's this access to information that is unprecedented in most of our lifetimes that these kids are now growing up with. So and the likelihood of being around people who are different than them in some culturally or sexuality wise or ability wise, and I don't want to say that people are more accepting. I do think that proximity and familiarity bring a level of comfort. And these kids they grew up, some of these 18-year-olds that are out here grew up knowing that Tamir Rice was killed as a kid, right? They saw that, and it changes you as a child to see something like that. And so I do think that the level of community that's building online and the ability to be more exposed to things outside of your culture or outside of your norm, outside of the small-minded people that live in small town Illinois, has definitely led to some of that. Um, and then there's also just, you know, the arrogance of youth, right? Which is a good thing sometimes. There are, I was watching a video today of a young man, a young white boy, down in southern Illinois, who stood out alone with a sign that said Black Lives Matter, and he was accosted by a white woman who called the police on him, and the police said, unfortunately, we have to let him stand here. And then he said, but Black Lives Matter, and the police said all lives matter to him. And he was a kid, and the audacity of youth, the arrogance of youth, to stand there and to stand his ground. Because, you know, when you can't tell a teenager nothing. I've been a teenager. You couldn't tell me a thing. And I'm okay with that. Honestly, I think that there because these kids have grown and seen this with their own eyes as children, and I think there's a lot of that with, if you talk to people who are older, who grew up in the 60s, right, who were young children in the 60s, that's where the most progressive white people I know were children in the 60s. The ones who, their children are less progressive than they are, because they grew up in their suburban silo, and this wasn't front of mind, like, you know, this wasn't something they were exposed to on a regular basis. But when people see this, especially as young children, because kids know so much, and they know right and wrong, and they care.
Verdell.
So I think there's that.
I would say, I think one thought I have about that is that at this point, and I think there's lots of reasons. I don't think there's any one reason. I think it's a bunch of reasons all smacked together. But one reason that's interesting to me, at least one thing that I think, is that it's the garishness of it, like just how, I mean, the way that these people are being killed, the way that it's happening. And in a way, it's not a good thing, but hey, we get it. It's not just like, it's, you know, someone's neck is being crushed, someone's house is being broken into and shot at, and someone's being like, it's just the sheer violence of it is enough to get people's attention. And so, and we see it, like, this stuff happens. It's happened all the time. I mean, I know so many people, I think, you know, that who've seen things like that. Like, I grew up understanding that the police were a threat. You know what I mean? I understood that. I grew up understanding that the police could do something to you even if you weren't doing anything wrong. And so that's something that I grew up with. And so, but I think for so many people who, it's not like, it is tough because it actually is the result of racism in a lot of ways. You know, it's like, oh, well, he wasn't stealing anything, and oh, well, he didn't look or sound like one of those. You know, but because it's just so outlandish, it's a type of racism that particularly unfortunately, a lot of progressives still kind of latch to. It's the, wow, this really hurts my feelings kind of racism. It's really sad racism, and not the come up off your money, you know, racism. And it really, in my view, it plays on that. So it's like, it's just, they're in shock. It's like, I just don't, like, when you hear people say, like, this just isn't the America that I believe in, it's just not my America. And it's like, well, yes and no. You know what I mean? Like, it's more shock. I mean, yay, they're out there. That's great. I mean, like, I saw some protests that were happening back home, and I mean, they look pretty diverse, and that's great. But I think you also have to look at the location where they are. You know, mine is the shore on New Jersey. It's going to be diverse, you know, in that way. And so, and depending on the time and the groups organizing and all that other stuff. But I just think that, I think another part that's worth mentioning is that I do think that a number of people at least know more now enough to give words to the fact that these struggles are interconnected. And so it's like they may
Mm-hmm.
not know how to live that out. They may not know what to do, but they have an understanding that, hey, I have student loan debt and prisons, and they can't write it, they can't say it, but they understand that they have to kind of do a number of things. Like it's not single issue type of thing. So I think that people are, like I said, we're in the middle of a pandemic. If people don't have any money, like the government took forever to give us $1,200. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And then they
a month.
disappeared and just
Yeah,
decided they were going to open up the world back to normal instead
yeah.
of
It's
like
like so.
give.
But people, I think that's what also makes it different. That people, I mean, Black people have been getting the brunt of this. Like I live in one of two counties in Maryland that the rest of the state opened up progressively as of 5 o'clock today, but not my county in Prince George's, because of the cases, because of our proximity to DC. And Black people are
Mm-hmm.
continuing to bear the brunt of that. And so people are tired, people are broke, people are poor. Like this is our country. As much as it's true that Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are experiencing the brunt of this, the overall quality of life for white people has gone down. White people are dying.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I
And,
mean? And so that's
and
something
not just
we really
dying from the societal problems, but also from the emotional and mental
yeah,
health issues that come from with it. White men are committing suicide at a higher rate
yeah,
than anyone
suicide,
else
alcoholism,
currently. Right. So
yeah,
yeah.
opioids, all these
Yes.
things. Like Roseanne, when that happened, as much as we said it was like I watched it finally, some of it, and as much as it was a mess, it was like, yeah, they're poor. She had a botched knee operation, and so she got hooked on pills. She was miserable. That's what a lot of people are
Wait,
living.
wait.
Like and the part that's challenging is that that person will still be racist, but also not understanding that the same situations that are messing us up will also mess them up. But I
You
think
know,
the
Mm-hmm.
other part, though, for us, and this is tricky, again, like the word is nuance here, we cannot win by ourselves.
Right.
We, like, the advances that we made, even in the 60s, did not come because we did it. We need coalitions. There is more, I've said this
Mm-hmm.
before, it's more coming with me and Jim Bob down the street than it is between me and Barack Obama. I don't know. We're not the same. You know what I mean? And I think that the next step in the next step is to understand how to build coalitions so that way we can actually build power to actually make deeper systemic changes. It's tough, it's hard, it's not for everybody, but that's what's going to get, at least in my view, part of what's going to get us to the next step is that when we can work together with groups of other people moving forward this multi-tiered agenda.
Mm-hmm.
when you
No,
talk
and
about
you.
people, I'm sorry, Courtney, when you talk about people not understanding the interconnectedness, the first person who came to mind was the old white guy who pulled out the bow and arrow in the crowd. He came to
What?
protect, he came to protect police,
Mm-hmm.
and he pulled out a bow and arrow to shoot at protesters. Long story short, he got his ass beat and they burnt up his car.
They burned his car.
And he was doing an interview. He's now, since then, he's been charged. Apparently, he had been in prison for like 20 years. So now he's been charged with all these crimes of like pointing a bow and arrow at people. But he did a news interview afterwards, and they asked him if he was going to the hospital. And what he said out with me so much because he said, I can't afford to go to the hospital. So here you have a man who is oppressed by the same systems that he's showing up to protect, and he can't even make the connection because he is holding on to his whiteness to have some sense of superiority over these people. Many of who probably have better health insurance than he does and have access to medical care. And
Yes.
it's amazing to me the people who defend the system when the system does not work for them.
I mean, he's sick, but he's still white. And I think he
Mm-hmm.
can't articulate that way, but he knows it. I remember in seminary, I had a friend who was white, and we were talking about it, and we were talking about how, like, he said, he was asking questions, and I guess I became known as the guy that if you had an honest question, as long as you were on, as long as you really wanted to hear what I was saying, I would let you ask your awful question. Um,
Mm.
as long as you actually hear me and actually hear
Oh,
what I'm
you were doing
saying.
the Lord's work.
I didn't do that with everybody, but it's like, okay, because at some point somebody has to ask it back. Like all of us have to ask the question. It's like that made
Mm-hmm.
whatever because we have to untangle what we thought we knew, right? And so I try to give that space when it's done in honesty, right? If you have an honest notch you have to work through, then fine, I'll let you ask it. But you have to take what I'm saying and do the work of untangling, or else I'm not going to do it no more.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was like, I don't understand because like both of us, because we were talking about upbringing, like, I grew up in the trailer park, we sat in the third, and I was like, but you're white.
Mm.
And he said, it's something that you don't understand. I said, I'm not saying that you did not have a hard life. What I'm saying is that no matter where I go, I am under suspicion. People will assume that I grew up poor. People will think that I got where I am or wherever I thought I was at that time. They will assume that I got there by sincere generosity, by help, by a handout. And they will assume that
Mm.
you got here because you worked hard. It's a certain
Mm-hmm.
level. Like, yes, you suffered, but it's a difference. Like the thing about it is that racism is such that I don't even have to discount what you went through in order to still keep the suffering that I've had to endure. It's different
Mm.
because no one's going to say, "Oh, well, look." Like no one can look at you. The way he looked today, you couldn't tell. But just the way, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm going to get treated a certain way often until I demonstrate otherwise. And even the compliments that I might get are like, "Wow, you're good for a Negro," kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
And so it's just a level that it's a
You're so
perceived,
articulate.
you know. Yeah, it's like you're so articulate. It's like what? And I think what makes it even more is that I grew up literally like in the hood, like the very much hood. And so it's like we came from where it's like, yeah, like we talked there. I don't know what you all thought happened. You thought we just sit around the fire and grunt at each other? I don't know what you thought happened in the hood. I don't know what you thought happened. Like we have libraries and people read books and people, we have showers and things there. Like, what do you mean? But it's I think that's really important that they just don't understand because that's how we got the United States. Honestly, like in the beginning of the formation of the United States, there were often uprisings where it was blacks and poor whites working together, and so that's what encouraged the powers that be to further stratify racism because to
Mm-hmm.
drive that wedge between people, at least for me, I'm wondering in my imagination if you can somehow undo that wedge, what would happen? Like what
Mm.
positive things could happen if you can get people to divest from whiteness and see the commonality, not in a we're all one kind of mamsy pamsy kind of way, but in the
Right.
fact that all of us are getting called by Sally Mae. None
Mhm.
of us can find a job for real. All of us have to pay too damn much for the rent. Like
Mhm.
all of these things that
Mhm.
sure it impacts us differently. It's the same demon, different punches in a way,
Mhm.
but it that we do better working together, and that the goal is to keep us apart, so that way we don't do what needs to be done. That we can argue amongst ourselves and be separate enough to not make deep systemic change. So.
Mm-hmm. And I actually want to go on that a little bit because what you said about coalition building is really important. And honestly, truth be told, is what got Dr. King killed, is what got Malcolm X killed. They didn't
Mhm.
care. Malcolm X wasn't killed when he was out there calling the white man the devil. Malcolm
Mm-hmm.
X was killed when he decided that he was going to work with the white man because though there were differences and nuances to the way the system oppressed, it wasn't the poor white person that was doing the oppressing, but the system that was oppressing everyone. And so that's coalition building is dangerous to the system, and that's why the system tries to suppress it at all costs. And the other, what you said, coalition building goes back to the very founding of the United States. The first person killed in the American Revolution was a black man named Crispus Attucks.
Mhm.
But one, that they don't tell you that in school because, you know, we get this whitewashed version of history, but also it just points to the importance of how the way change has come about has always been people of different experiences coming together to improve upon the common good. And so that's one of the really important things that we need. I mean, if we're just talking about Black folks, we're only 13% of the United States. Like, we are 13 we are 13% of the population. And so we can't get a thing done by ourselves. And I know that there are some people, I've heard it, I've witnessed it, that say we don't need these white people here. Like, no, we need the white people. We need the white people. We need the Latinos. We need the indigenous folks. We need the Asian people. We need everybody. Anybody that want to work can work. As long as you're here, because honestly, I wish we could get the All Lives Matter people to really believe that all lives matter. Because if they actually believed it, then we wouldn't even have to have these conversations. Like, if the pro-life people actually believed that all life was sacred, we wouldn't have to have these conversations, because we got more people yelling all lives matter, all pro-life, this life is sacred, no abortion, but still support the death penalty, which is racist. Pro-life, but don't want to provide health care. Pro-life, but and if we could get people who claim that they are pro-life, claim that all lives matter, to actually do the work that they say they believe in, we will get somewhere. So we need folks, and we need people who believe all lives matter, but who will prioritize Black lives right now, because we the ones dying.
Like, this is such a great segue, because my next question was around the white church and what the white church should be doing in this moment. I recently watched a live stream of 8 mainline ministers, white ministers, mainline church, ministers of mainline, whatever. I recently watched a live stream of 8 white ministers of mainline Christian churches. That is what I've been trying to say. And they were there discussing white privilege, really. And they talked about, like, when was the first time that they recognized they had privileges that other people didn't, that non-white people didn't have. And they also talked, the question that stood out to me was, what is the thing that is stopping you from discussing white privilege with your congregation? And all of their answers were really situated in fear. It was fear of being divisive in an environment when they feel like the church is already so divided on things like LGBTQ issues and the social political divide that comes up in their churches. They feel like discussing white privilege it will divide instead of bringing people together. There was the fear of losing people from a practical, their money is going to go out the door too, but also losing souls for God. So my question for you all is, like, what would you advise white ministers to do in this moment? Like, what should the white church be doing in this moment of advocating for Black lives and racial justice?
So I guess white ministers, white church leaders, this is an opportunity for them to decide if they really truly believe the gospel, right? I mean, that's really what it is. Would you have been the person that, like, Jesus was preaching, blessed are the poor? Would you be like, no, Jesus, blessed are all people? Or would you say, yeah, blessed are the poor, because there are poor people and they need help. The rich people don't need. Do you believe that there is good news for everyone? And if you do you believe that Jesus was the way to that good news? Because Jesus was killed for opposing a political system. He was killed for opposing a religious system that was upheld by, and what happened was that the religious leaders used the political system to execute Jesus because he was in their way of continuing to oppress people in the name of God. And so what it's an opportunity for people to go back and read the Bible and not just quote scripture here and there. So one thing that I really don't like, and I don't do well, is get in a battle of scriptures with people. Like, you see people have these debates and they get in these forums and they just throw scriptures back and forth.
It's like Yu-Gi-Oh cards. It doesn't work.
Right. It doesn't work. And also, and it doesn't work. And honestly, I'm really bad at quoting scripture because my theology, my idea of who God is and who Jesus is and what the gospel is, isn't rooted in this scripture, this scripture, that scripture, but in the fullness of scripture, right? If you in the fullness of the text, what does it say? In the fullness of the gospel, because the gospel isn't just contained in those books that we call gospels, right? There was good news. They were talking about the good news in the Old Testament. They were talking about the good news in Isaiah 61, where Jesus, the passage that Jesus lifted up when he said, "I'm here to change some stuff, y'all." They were talking about good news. And so in the fullness of the text, what is the good news? And if you look at that and you still decide that you don't care that the system is killing people, then you don't believe that Jesus' death was, you don't believe that Jesus' resurrection, because Jesus died. Like, you could be an atheist and believe that Jesus died because Jesus was it's been verified. Jesus was a historical figure who was crucified. You don't have to believe that Jesus got up, which is what makes us Christian, to believe that Jesus died. So the power in the resurrection was that the state could not kill Jesus, could not kill the movement, but that there was still something after that, that there was, even in that death and what came after it, the movement that it sparked, there was a chance at life, right? And so, do you believe that? Do you actually believe that Jesus' death was victory over a political system that was death dealing? Or sorry, I'm sitting here drinking my you know what I mean. Do you believe the resurrection was victory over a death dealing system that only dealt death to the poor, to the marginalized, to the lower class, to those who were on, to the sick? Do you believe that? And if you do, Jesus said to take up the cross and follow him. And so this is your moment. This is your chance to take up the cross. And the thing about a cross is that it's heavy. It costs you something to bear it. So the fear of this fear is, to me, it's like, yeah, it's going to cost you something, whether it's ties, whether it's people being mad at you, whether it's people calling you out your name, telling you that calling you all kinds of stuff, because it will happen. It always happens when you take a stand for something. Like, you lose people, you lose members, you lose standing in community, you lose fellowship. You're going to have other pastors within your denomination who castigate you, who, kind of you're going to become an outcast. But it costs something. Like, it should cost something. This was not free. Salvation is free to all, but it's not free.
Verdell, what do you think the white church should be doing in this moment?
Well, first I'll share an experience. I've worked for, a white minister who took racial justice seriously, and he was the regional minister, and he got all types of letters from people threatening and all of the other stuff. So it's a very real possibility for folks, and I think that that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And I'm going to come at it a little bit just from I know we're talking about theology, but I think it's impossible for where I am now not to seep in to how some of this is being discussed.
No, you are here because we want your whole self in this conversation. So please.
I think that it definitely highlights the reality of what, honestly, just about all church institutions are, for better or for worse, is that, the money. People have to eat. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, because I was a minister and collecting checks and I wanted my check and I didn't want it to bounce. Like, I wanted my stuff. So I'm not saying that in a, oh my God, ministers should just go preach and go home type of thing. Just give me a dinner and that's it. But what I'm saying is that just the way that it's what we would like things to be, and the veneer of beliefs and theological aspirations, if you will. And then that Sunday morning, but then Sunday afternoon, when you're counting the bills, and it's like, well, we're short. How are we going to pay the rent, the light bill? Sister Carolyn needs new wheels on the car. We got to pay pastor's parsonage, whatever. I would say for a lot of white ministers, and I will say a phrase that my seminary professor said to me in homiletics class. We were talking about LGBTQ issues, and what I raised is that, a lot of people say that they're afraid of losing their jobs if they speak out about it. And what he said was, Jesus never promised that you'd be able to keep your job. Jesus never promised that. Jesus said he didn't have a place to lay his head, that even foxes have holes, but he doesn't have anywhere to lay his head. And I know that sounds very cutthroat, but I think in a time when people still talk about what God's way is and all that other stuff, and this is what God wants. God wants you to have sex like this, and God wants you to spend your money like that. And it's like, oh, well, God also wants you to basically put your life on the line and be tortured to death for the right thing. Notice how there's nothing there. Nothing there with that. They leave that part alone. Nobody wants to be like Christ like that.
Right.
I think also it's just indicative of just how it's, like I said last week, I don't want a world where there's no religion, no Christianity. I think, one, that's not fair, and two, that's just unrealistic. But I would like a world where Christians are a lot more like Jesus, the Jesus of the text, than what most Christians, frankly, are today. That it's an idea of Jesus as basically a teddy bear. A teddy bear who's very upset at how you have sex and very upset about how you express your gender, but cares little about everything else. Everything else is heaven, but watch what you do with your parts and watch what you do with your wallet. And that a revolution would need to take place with white Christians in order for that to happen. Because, again, keep in mind, most white Christians are Republicans. Most white women are Republicans. And so these things are tangled up now. These things are all mixed together. And so you would need to have a radical, well, I don't like using the word radical that way. You would need to have a significant revolution in how white Christians position their faith and their race in order to see that happen. But particularly for, I would just say to use your privilege in ways, maybe, and maybe for them, maybe they have kids to feed and put through college, right? So maybe that's the case for them too. So I'll extend that same grace to them. What I always say to people, whether it's in this situation or others, is look to see where you have political, social capital to spend. Where do you have influence? Where can you, I don't want you to give up your power necessarily. I want you to use it in a way to make something happen. Don't become powerless for me. Use your power to make something happen for me. So that way, use your power to make the world into something different. That, you know what I mean? In that type of way. And if you want to be theological about it, that's what Christ supposedly did, right? That's the idea that you can do things now too. And so if you're in a room and you're the white guy and you see no black people talking about racism, well, say something and then bring somebody in, have an actual legit MLK, how just figure out where to spend your capital to actually get the work done. Be strategic, sure, but learn where and how to spend your capital to in a situation where I have the pull to make this happen, and then make it happen. I think that is more beneficial. Like, force a conversation, force the issue in ways that make sense. You don't necessarily flip over a table per se, but if you run the program, you can invite the preacher. If you run the whatever, there's just all sorts of things that you can do to use your power and your influence to make things happen. Like I always say, look around and see who's not in the room. And if you can somehow bring someone in the room who was not invited, either figuratively or literally, do that.
Courtney has company.
Legos flying over my head. Oh my goodness.
So I have had a really hard thoughts around this. Like, I feel like y'all are being very kind now, and I am at the point where I'm like, if you are still complicit in the conversation, the blood is on your hand. Like, police have been allowed to act this way because of silence of white people, because Black people have been talking about this for a long, long time. And I mean, I can think the first time that I remember hearing it when I was around 10 and Rodney King. And then I think of hearing about Sean Bell. Like, these are periods in my childhood that I've always heard about police planting guns and drugs on people. Black people have been talking about these injustices. White people have been silent, and that has empowered the police and officials to continue with these practices. So I feel like to continue to be silent, to choose to do nothing, it not only shits on the dignity of Black people, it's sinful to choose your self-preservation over the humanity of another person. Am I being too harsh in this judgment?
I would say, see, I look at it differently. I think that's a very human thing to do. And I think that's
Mm,
just coming from where it is. It's like you want to preserve yourself,
mm-hmm.
which even if they can't articulate it, which means that they fully understand that there are certain benefits afforded to them that aren't afforded to somebody else. And that disrupting this means that they no longer have those, which is true and not true in certain levels. Um, I think that it's two sides of a coin. It's very human to think about only you and yours,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's also human to work together, and those
Mm-hmm.
are two sides of the same human coin. We have the propensity for both. Even you want to get real sciencey.
Mm-hmm.
Chimpanzees are the same way. Chimpanzees work together. They work together to catch things, right, in their group. But if somebody gets to an argument, they literally will beat another chimp to pieces and rip it apart. They'll
Mm.
do that. And
Oh,
so even in our closest, animal ancestors, like our closest cousins, those things are evident too. And we do the same thing.
so
Like
you're
they're
saying we evolved from chimpanzees, Verdell?
well, yeah, I mean, well, not from chimpanzees, from a common ancestor.
Mhm.
But I think it's the idea that, you know, these parts are human tendencies, and it takes effort and intention to lean into the better part of that human tendency, the cooperation, the working together, to seeing everybody as equals. Because again, and even in the same situation, you have, bonobos are nowhere near as violent, also very close cousin. I know I'm getting really nerdy here, but I think it just I come from a very point that it's like it's human. It's human to be this way. It's human to be like ravage, destroy, but in their mind, they're doing it for their own benefit of them and theirs. But if we
Mhm.
have a bigger understanding of what them and theirs is really we and us, if we can
Mhm.
develop that, then it's better. And to understand that, hey, it's better for everybody if Black people aren't living in fear. It's better for everybody if folks can afford their rent. It's better for everyone if they can get the health care that they need. And I think that if we lean more into that, like for me, that's I think for me the frustration comes in with people who know better, who
Mhm.
honestly know the game. Like, cause like there's some people who don't know. What I mean? Like that dude with the bow and arrow, he don't know. You know what I
Hey,
mean? Like doesn't make what he's doing any less wrong, but he probably has not sat and thought through all this. He's just kind of he's like a toy that's been spun and wound up, like many people are, and they just kind of go. But the folks who architect these types of things, those are the folks who know. Those are the folks who you pour out all the fire on them, because they're doing this. They are the ones who are winding this up. And so I reserve my most heated anger for those folks. But I think that it's okay to have any wide range of emotions during this time, because all of them are valid, and it's true. It's like people are choosing to be like, it doesn't matter. And I think just because of me being a queer person is something that you experience in various levels, and you see it when you see it, at least when you see it at so many levels and experience it on so many levels, like first from white people, then from your own people, you see it from their family, then even your own family, and then you just see how it's the same social mechanisms that get people to just be like, well, it ain't my problem, and turn around. We all do it. We all have the capacity to do it, and we all have done it in our own ways. And so that maybe stops me from being, I won't say judgmental, but it just helps to keep me in check. So that way I always check myself to say, okay, in what ways do I have the option to opt out where I shouldn't? And so that way I can live that in my own life, and then recognize why other people do it in there. So that way you can kind of break it down, because when you try to yank them out of that, this is what I've learned. It's about people's sense of self. A lot of the arguments that people are having, particularly when you want to mix theology into it, it's it's not logical. They didn't sit down and think about A plus B equals C. They didn't do that. What they did is said, this is how I see myself to be in the world. This is how I make sense of myself. And if you come in here with your books and your learning and whatever, it's not about convincing me mentally that you're right. It's about, if you take this away, I am not who I am anymore. And so if people are defending their sense of who they see themselves to be, and so that's why logic and things don't work to convince them, because they see themselves a certain way, and without something to put in its place, they will only clamp down harder, because in their mind they don't exist, because this is how they conceptualize themselves to be. If I'm not white, and if Black people aren't, and whiteness is just, in my view, just a vis-a-vis of, oh, we're not that over there, because like, what is it? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it's not even like, it's like, I can tell you what Italian looks like. I can tell you what Armenian looks like. I can tell you what English or Irish or Scottish looks like. Just flat, straight out white, it's always against something else. And so it's just like, it's, if Black people aren't these, if I cannot bounce my sense of self and worth off of what Black people are or aren't, then who am I? You know what I mean? And that's a crisis of consciousness, and a crisis of, maybe not consciousness, but it's an existential crisis, and that's why people don't want to lean into it. And so it's not about letting them off the hook, but understanding that is what says, oh, okay, I get it. You don't get it, but I understand. Like, you literally don't know how to function as a person if you don't have these racist ideas.
Yeah. But so here's this idea of people, because this is the way people are. They are irrational, and they cloak their irrationality. They like baptize it and put it in Christian language, and like Christians are really good at that.
Spiritualize it.
But Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And it is, I mean, if you read Proverbs, if you read the Proverbs, probably a good 25% of them talk about wisdom, right? Like, anti-intellectualism is ungodly. Like, it's not godly to decide that you're going to turn off your thinking brain and just act on pure emotion and pure instinct. And even like this idea of self-preservation is really antithetical to the gospel and the ministry of Jesus. Jesus said that that it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. He told the rich prince that came to him, go, okay, do all these things. And he was like, oh, I've followed the commandments and I've done all this. I followed the letter of the law, but not the heart of it, right? And Jesus said, give away all your wealth, and then sure, you can come with me. And the rich man, he was like, no, I can't do that. And just like, deuces. Because when you have that position of privilege, you have to give it up. Because to have a position of privilege means there's someone that you are willing to say doesn't deserve it, so that you can have. And not that we should live in a society where we're all giving up what we need, so that like we shouldn't all want the lot of the least of these, the most marginalized, right? We should want the most marginalized to have what the most privileged have. We should want the most marginalized. We should want everyone to have access to good health care. We should want everyone to have access to education. Like, and honestly, it's the thing about people with privilege is, and what kills me about white liberals is that not that they don't believe that Black folks should have what they have. Well, not that they don't believe that Black folks should have healthcare, access to healthcare, access to education. They do. They think that we should have it, right? White liberals, they really do. I believe in the bottom of their heart, believe that Black folks should have better than what we have. We just shouldn't have as good as what they have. And you see that with with all these things. Like, there are white liberals who want Black, they want to make sure, like, to help. They're in the struggle, they're all that. But when you get in a private place where they think you don't belong, it's not that they want us all stuck in, in the projects or whatever. They want us all to have access to like a regular lower middle class life where everybody has what they need and nobody's starving. But they still want a level of power and privilege and access to things that make them exclusive. And that's the part where you have to be willing to give up hierarchy to actively engage in Christian community. Because, and if you look at Acts and you look at what the Christian community originally looked like, it was this radical reimagination of what society should be. And we have completely lost that especially when we're talking about the white church and how things operate. And considering all of the things that go into the hierarchy and the structure of society we have in America today, and I would argue around the world, where we're seeing, like, it's not just America where we're seeing this white supremacist resurgence. It's across the globe. But my really what my thought is around this is that it has to cost. Hierarchy has to go, like, that has to go. And if you're not willing to say that everyone deserves to have what they need, not necessarily the same, right? Because if everyone has the same, like, what serves you doesn't necessarily serve me, doesn't necessarily serve them. But everyone should have what they need, and no one should, like, this holding on to power is what causes the problems that we continue to have. And that's why the white church isn't willing to give up, to speak out, to risk it all, because they want to still hold on to whiteness. Not that they necessarily think that Black people should die. There are some people who have chosen evil, right? There are people who literally say, no, kill them all. Like, I don't care, run them over, shoot them, whatever. But there are more who are just like, well, no, give them what they need, but just make sure you give me better. And that is what I think Jesus was getting at when he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. People like take this to say, oh no, pay your taxes and just, like, follow the rules of the law. No, Jesus said, give Caesar back his stuff. Like, give him back his hierarchy, give him back his government, give him back his political power. Give Caesar what's Caesar's. Because that's not what Jesus is. Like, that's not what we do over here.
Y'all have said so much good stuff, so much stuff. You've left people with so much to ponder in this moment as they figure out their role in the protest for Black lives. Is there anything that I did not ask you that you wish I had asked you?
I wish you would have asked me more about the temple.
Verdell,
Ooh.
talk to us, because so my intern, shout out to Cameron, my intern. Cameron is my son, guys. So my intern has been going through all of the past shows and putting together little snippets and videos. And I have not watched all of the ones that he has put together, but he did put together a clip that we posted today on our social media of you from our Life After Faith show, where you talked about Jesus in the temple, and you talked about it as an uprising. Hold on. I wrote your quote down.
Oh, wow. I forgot I talked about that.
You got a quote.
Oh,
Jesus
goodness.
really wasn't nonviolent. And this is some ellipses in here. But this is the gist of what you said. Jesus really wasn't nonviolent after all. Calling him nonviolent is kind of a stretch. It's a simplification of it. Jesus and his folks, I can't read my writing. Jesus and his folks staged an uprising. It was a revolt. And this was you talking about what happened in the temple. Verdell, teach us about the temple.
Okay, let me crack my knuckles. All right, so one thing that biblical scholars do, they do this whole rigmarole where they try to see what types of things and anecdotes and stories, if you will, go back to what they would consider being the historical Jesus. And so one of the things that they used to figure out is that something is mentioned over and over and over again. And so if something is mentioned over and over again, then that it means it's a high chance that something in this story is close to, or at least happened in some version, capacity in the life of the historical Jesus. And because of that, you see the temple narrative happen in every gospel, including John's gospel, which is like the weird one.
Yeah.
And so that's and the reason why people think that Jesus ministered for 3 years is because Jesus goes to the temple 3 times in John's gospel, but in the synoptics it's only once. And so they don't portray Jesus as having a 3-year ministry, if you will. Only John does that. And so at each time you have that, whether it's the first or the third, but just like if 3 people tell you a story and there's differences and nuances, but they all talk about a red car being there, then you can kind of know that, well, there was probably a red car there because they had different things, but they all talked about that. And so there's something about that story that matters. And so
I just want to, Jesus' birth story is not even the same in all 4 gospels. So this want to go ahead.
There wasn't a need for it. I think that's the thing too. Like the need for a birth story developed as the gospels spread further and further away, because they had to do something to highlight that this person was important and that it mattered, and that everybody in those times who was deemed to have, again, much like the Roman emperor, to have some sort of divine origin story. And so that's why, like Paul is the earliest writings, and he doesn't even mention the origin of birth story. It's not even mentioned. And so about the temple, what you get to understand is that the temple was not like a church, right? It was like, say it's a church, a mall, a bank, and customs all mixed together, right? All types of people are going in and out and through. Of course, everybody couldn't go through every part, but that's, we won't get to that point at this point. But when this happened during the Passover, this was high alert. It's also, there was their version of police, Roman police, all around, because the Israelites were unruly. Because, like most people, they don't like being subjugated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to also realize that there were many messiahs, right? Jesus was actually not a good messiah when he was alive. There are
Mm.
messiahs who actually, quote unquote, did better in terms of like leading on revolts, pushing back the Romans, and the way they were challenged, the way they were notarized. Jesus' fame came way later for
Mm.
different reasons, and so this is all against this backdrop. And the Romans knew it was this messianic fervor because people were being oppressed and all the other. So this is all the backdrop. All this is happening, and most people who came from the area of Palestine that Jesus came from hated the temple. They thought it was corrupt. They thought it was the money changers there, particularly. What they would do is, like, let's say you have to go somewhere and they say, okay, you come into this. If let's say you can only, if you went to the grocery, you went to Kroger's, and you can only use Kroger money, and you had to exchange your money for Kroger money, and so for every $3, they gave you something that was only worth $1 Kroger money, which means your money is wasted. And so you had to change money to do that. People would be taking money off top. All types of corrupt things would happen there. And it was like a socio-political center of what people hated about Roman occupation and the well-to-do Jews that helped mediate it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I researched this, and when I talked about it and I really looked into it, most stories say that Jesus made a whip, a cat o' nine tails, and flipped over tables and did all of this. And, this got the attention of the authorities. They went to find him. Jesus betrayed him. He got arrested, tortured, and killed, la, la, la,
Wait,
la.
my lamb and lion Jesus was whipping people all up through the
Well,
temple.
see, here's the thing why I even said last week that calling Jesus nonviolent is a stretch.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that Jesus ever was like, hey, let's get swords and cut people up. Jesus never said that.
Uh-huh.
But
But he did say get swords.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, yeah, but he did talk about the sword and separating people, right? But one, it's pretty violent to say if you disturb one of these little ones, it's better to be thrown to the bottom of a lake with the stone around your neck. That's pretty violent.
Mm-hmm.
And how it was God to remove the Romans? Was he going to hug them out?
Mm.
Was God going to
Mm-hmm.
scoop the Romans up in his arms of love and lovingly place them back in Italy? Was he going to do that? No. Like, he believed that God, I don't have to fight this battle because God is going to kill them all and boot them out, which would have been a typical Jewish thing to think at the time. But back to the typical for the protest, I don't know how you non-violently make and brandish a whip. I don't know how you do that non-violently. I don't know how you non-violently flip over a table. But keep in mind also just the size of this place. One person with a whip by themselves would not have been enough to cause such commotion in order to get such attention.
Oh.
Just one
Mm-hmm.
person? Like, imagine if there's one person, and they say you go into a store and there's police officers there, and it's one person flipping over, knocking over stuff at Kroger. Well, that don't take much. Like, how did he get away? You know what I mean? How did
Mm-hmm.
he get away? Have to be found. Like, this is a much bigger operation than Jesus just got pissed off and did whatever. You can't just make a whip in 5 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Like this was intentional. This
There
was
was
on
some
purpose.
premeditation here.
This was premeditated. This wasn't just some I'm so angry, let me make something and just lose my mind. No, because how would he had escaped? He had help. This was a bigger thing. This was intentional. And even if it wasn't like intentional, this is a riot. Jesus would have probably been just fine because again, he was a terrible Messiah, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was no reason for the authorities to care about him. No one cared. No one cared about him. What made them care is when about the uprising part. That's what made them care because it was the Passover. That Passover was always a very tense time. You have Jews coming in from all around the world, and Romans wanted to keep the peace. There was no reason to care about Jesus. I mean, even though I'm saying that he wasn't neatly nonviolent, again, like I'm saying, he wasn't really good. he wasn't leading armed revolts or anything. So the Romans were like, okay, you want to heal poor people? We don't care about them anyway. Fine, sure, we don't care. So something about this event is what gets us to the Jesus. It creates a situation where now Jesus, what happens to him and the events that ultimately end his life are what contribute to why we even understand him the way that we do today. That wouldn't have happened if he didn't do that. And the more you dig into the situation, the more it's apparent, at least to me, this was a protest. It was intentional. It was a riot, for better or for worse. And I mean, how would he have gotten away? One person? No, that's not how these types of things work. And so when you understand the temple and how it was set up, what the intentionality and things that happen afterward, it becomes clear that there was very much intention to do this thing, and that Jesus saw himself and his people in some sort of role. He probably expected it to turn out the way that it did, but it was intentional, and I think it's in something for Christians. Even when I was a Christian, that I sat with, it's like, you know what, God. It's violent. I think violence has nuances to it. It doesn't mean that you have to sign on and be like, okay, let's go to war tomorrow. But this idea that we can somehow, that violence is absent from our world, and that we can somehow shield ourselves from the reality of violence, whether it be our own or the ones that people inflict on us in other ways. It's just, history does not bear that out. History says that really isn't true. So it does not mean that I'm saying that, oh my God, if you don't agree with riots and flipping over tables, that something is wrong. I just think that it just highlights how the things that we're expecting for people in the name of being Christian is literally not what the founder of it thought. There was clearly a time to make a whip or flip over a table. There clearly was a time for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really, I think even more to add to that, not more than that thought, but to add to it, Jesus, like you said, couldn't have done that just on his own. Though we see, like, in the text, Jesus went in the temple and he, like, whipped the folks and turned the tables over and stuff. But we know that there were people with him, and we know that there were the people who were with him had some experience with revolting, right? We have Simon the Zealot. Right. So we have Simon the Zealot, and Jesus intentionally, like, Jesus had a lot of disciples that we don't have their names, but the 12 we do know. One of them, and he's not just called Simon in the text, right? Like, they didn't drop the Zealot, which means that
he was known for
like
that.
Not only was he known for it, but the writers of the Gospels thought it was important that we know it. That we, as the readers of the gospel, we as the people who are hearing this throughout the communities that those were written for, and then now hear us, this many years later, if we're following this same thought, this same ideology, it's important that we know it, that this was a zealot, and the zealots were known for rioting. They were flipping over tables. They were killing folk. They like, flipping over the table wasn't nothing new for a zealot. And so, and it's a little mild. And then the other thing is, you have Peter, the other Simon Peter. So I like Simon the Zealot and Simon Peter. But Peter he went with the sword, and he cut off a centurion's ear. And only one gospel, I want to point this out, shows Jesus healing that ear. So
y'all really making me appreciate the New Testament. Like, I'm an Old Testament girl, because Old Testament, it's drama everywhere, and I hadn't dug into the New Testament and gotten that feel. Y'all are enticing a love, and for me to dig deeper into the New Testament right now. So I appreciate.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And like Verdell said, in terms of, like, when you see the same thing in 2, 3, 4 gospels, you kind of take that to be true. When I only see it in one place, I'm looking at John with a side eye, like, did Jesus really heal his ear? Or I don't remember who said it, but it's like, did Jesus really heal his ear? Or are you just trying to, like, are you writing this to appease the community that you're writing to? Because in that community, the Jesus right hand man cutting off the one that Jesus left the one who Jesus said, "Upon this rock I build my church." By the way, the Peter who was carrying swords and stuff, Jesus left him and said, "You in charge now." And Peter was like, "I don't even know if I'm really here for this. I'm about to go fishing for a minute and figure it out." But but Jesus, he was a sword carrying, which kind of gets me into my thoughts of these old Baptist preachers that I used to know, who had a Bible in one hand and a gun in the briefcase, because but and so this idea of this passive Jesus is not only not borne out in Jesus' own actions, but it also in the characterization of the people that Jesus had around him, who helped him to carry out this movement.
I think more to your point, the word there I believe is lestos in Greek, and that gets translated as like a bandit, but it's not like a thief. It's a it's more like a freedom fighter. That's really more of what it means. And so it just goes more to the point that Courtney brought up, that again, these aren't some kindly, friendly little fisher people. These are folks who get down with the get down. And it was a lot more than just those 12. These are some rough and tough folks, particularly if they're associating in some connections with John the Baptist and his groups of people. And so these folks were ready to get down. To the fact that, think about it, and particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus has to tell them not to fight, which means that they were ready to. He has to tell them, no, don't do that. That's not how the king is going to come. Not this way. Because that was the way they were inclined to. And so it's novel that he had to tell them that time, no, don't.
Right.
Which makes you wonder, what was it about this time that made them say, okay, fine. And so that's the thing, is the intentionality. And those are those things that pop out when you learn how to read the text and see. I will admit that the Old Testament is a bit easier, because it's like it's laid a bit more bare for you.
Yes,
and
yeah.
The New Testament is just kind of like, you have to kind of like see between the lines, since they really were not so, like you have to figure out a little harder to see it. But yeah, I mean, Jesus was not. I mean, I'm coming at it from a person not a person of faith anymore. But even if someone is a person of faith, I think it's important to sit with what's actually there. And it doesn't mean to go get a rock and crash a window today. That's not what I think any of us are saying.
Right.
But if I'm going to be so quick to judge the person who does that today, I'm literally talking about Jesus. Like, that's literally what Jesus did. And to say, that ain't godly. Well, don't you think Jesus was God? Jesus basically did the equivalent of breaking a window. So what's that about? It's just to get people to think, to really honestly sit with their faith and say, look, I personally am uncomfortable with this, which is valid and fine. It's fine. But Christianity, for as much as Black people have decided to use it to our own advantage, it also has been a tool that has been used to cause us to, the knee jerk to forgive. And oftentimes we are the ones that are perpetuating that amongst ourselves to make ourselves behave and that sort of thing. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind too, that every single thing that we have, I can't think of one civil right that was gained, or rights period, that did not come about because basically someone got threatened to get their shit fucked up. Like, none of it. And whether, like, even nonviolence, when we think about nonviolence in the civil rights movement, there's a lot of scholarly arguments that the reason why nonviolence worked is because there was the threat of violence. Like, we're talking about, like, the people, Baptist preacher with the Bible in one hand and the gun, people were packing. People this idea that people were smacked by like some type of Care Bear stare, and white people decided to all of a sudden think better. It was violence, either seeing the violence that was happening to Black people, or oh God, if we don't do something, they're going to throw this whole thing over. So let's give them something so they'll calm down. So violence, again, it's not a glorification of it, but this idea that we even get to the world that we're at right now without the threat of things being really jacked up somehow, it's just not. History doesn't give us that. And yet you look at the Bible and see, hey, look, It's just not there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and oh, so even yesterday, the eulogy, right? Al Sharpton, he took a text, and it was
Was
a
that a
good
eulogy?
text. Yeah, it was. Well, it was. It. Listen, we're not about to get
We're
into
not
that.
gonna go there. Did you
We're not
reference
about to get
her?
into all that. But he took a text, and he took a text, and the text could have done so much in that moment, and he did what he did what Al Sharpton does, and he did it well. But if I had preached that text, I would have talked all the way about how to everything there is a season, and there's a time for everything. There is a time to plant, and there's a time to pluck up. There's a time to kill. It's in there. It says there's a time to kill. There's a time for peace, and there's a time for discord. There's a time for everything, and being strategic in what you do and doing it in the right time is also important. So even like when Verdell's talking about, Jesus said, "Not this time, y'all. We ain't about to fight this time," because Jesus said to everything, there is a time. Like there's a time. Every season has its time. This ain't the season for fighting, but there is a season for it. And even during the civil rights era, there was, this isn't the season for violence, but there is violence on the other side of it. Like everything has an inverse, a converse, and like on the flip side. So right now we're doing nonviolence, but let this keep going and violence is gonna come. So that text is such a powerful text if you really really think about it and dig into it and look at all the different ways that it could be used. But it's really interesting to me, just to think about even Jesus and the way he navigated that, the events that unfolded up to his death and his ultimate protest, right? Yeah, it's just, there's a season for nonviolence. Is it today? I don't know. There's a season for breaking windows. Is it today? I can't really tell you. I can't answer that question, but I know that it's valid, and there is a season for it. There's a season for tearing shit up. Like there's a season for building.
I think
What
what's
season
also
is this?
I think it's also important to note that even with the way his crucifixion, most of the time people were already dead when they were crucified.
Oh, wait.
They weren't.
Pause?
Yeah, so the story in Jesus being crucified and alive is unique because most people were dead, and if they weren't dead, they died. It took them a long time to die if they weren't, because the main reason why you die in crucifixion is that asphyxiation, you can't breathe
You
because you're held
suffering.
up like this,
Yeah.
and you lose the
Ooh.
strength, and that can take a very long time. The fact that Jesus died in hours, I mean, after all the vicious things that happened to him, I mean, that can call the story into some question. But the fact that he was flogged and tortured and whipped and then told to carry his cross through the square, like when you would go into Jerusalem, you would see crosses of people crucified and see what their crime was over their heads as a deterrent. And so it was likely way more than just Jesus and the three men crucified. They probably a bunch of people crucified that day. It was
So
probably
are
a bunch
you
of people crucified, probably a bunch of folks that were crucified, and we probably wouldn't. It's not a stretch of the imagination to assume that numerous people who were involved in Jesus' insurrection and insurrection started Passover were crucified at the same time.
wow. So are you saying that crucifixion was less about death and more about like putting the body on display?
It was a deterrent. It was a deterrent to say that, like, that's why Jesus was accused of being king of the Jews. That was his crime that was put over his head. And so let's say if you're walking, like let's say if you were driving into Atlanta, right? So to use a modern day example, you're driving into Atlanta, and as you're driving in the freeway, you see the "Welcome to Atlanta" sign, and all of a sudden you start driving past crosses with people, corpses, birds eating the eyeballs, whatever. This one, lied on their taxes. That one jaywalked. That one did this. That one did that. It was a deterrent, and usually you were already dead before they crucified you, and the point was that you were denied an actual burial. That was the point. It's like to make a spectacle of you. and of
Mhm.
your crime, so that people would be in line. So crucifixion was more of not that people didn't, not that people weren't crucified alive. It's just that it was more of the spectacle of it to deter people, and that the story of Jesus himself, like let's say that most of that is rooted in fact. I think even like if it's rooted in fact with the way how he was beaten and had to get flogged and whipped and carried across all this other stuff, it just also goes to show you that there was something unique about what he did that caused all
Mhm.
that to happen, to put him on such display. There was
Mhm.
something that needed to be deterred about what he was doing and saying in that moment. And so I think that's important to highlight, that even like whether people debate about whether that was historical because it's such a strange way for crucifixion to go down, let's
Uh-huh.
assume that it was. If it was out of the ordinary, it demonstrates just how what he did, just how his actions were viewed by the state. Because it was the Jews did not kill Jesus; the Romans did. I think
Mhm.
that's something
Mm-hmm.
that the Gospels, one
Mhm.
of their big their probably one of their biggest failures is that they blame the Jews, and
Jews.
it makes anti-Semitism really easily. But no, the Jews had no authority to use crucifixion. Was a Roman tool
Mhm.
of torture, and the Jews had no authority to do that in and of themselves. And so that
Mm-hmm.
the Romans are the ones who. I'm not saying that there weren't some Jews, the powers that be, who were okay with it, but it was large. By and large, it was the Romans. It was the Romans who did it, not the Jews. But I
You
think this demonstrates that what he did was, yeah, it was that big a deal in that brief moment that they had. We have to get him out of here, make an example of him, so people don't do this anymore.
you made a connection from the cross to the lynching tree and how that was used as to put people on display and as a warning, a deterrent. And also, it makes me think of how police allow their victims of violence to lay out in the streets for hours
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
deterrent. So yeah, it's interesting to see the similarities from the cross to modern day victims of state sanctioned violence.
Yep, it's
Courtney.
fear. It's fear.
Mhm.
It's a spectacle. It's like, look at this. You know, that's an important part of controlling people in that way. When you want to maintain an empire, you want people to be afraid of you, so they're
Mhm.
afraid
Mm-hmm.
to act.
Yeah, and I really like how you pointed out that it wasn't the religious powers that crucified Jesus, but it was the Roman government, and that there was some maybe some like usage of political governing structure, the state, through the through those religious powers, because Jesus posed a threat to them as well. But it wasn't that they didn't have the power to do it on their own. And I really like, to me, it brings me to the corollary of the white church and how we have the white church has co-opted the Republican party really at this point, and the white church, who glorifies whiteness, let's be clear, but they're religious, you know they have taken Christian language and they have baptized whiteness in it, but they have then taken that and co-opted the Republican Party and have co-opted the government at this point, and are using the state to carry out their religious agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mhm.
and it really, that correlation is really like clear when you think about it that way. That the religion on its own can't kill someone, right? I mean, let me take that back, because religion, and when we get to the part where we talk about what I wish you would have asked, we're going to talk about the Syrophoenician
That is
woman,
my next.
and
That's my next question. So go
so
ahead.
actually, I'll just go right on into it
Yeah.
then. So religion can kill. It is powerful enough to do that. It cannot do it in a way that it's within religion. There is hierarchy. So there's the white church that has co-opted the government now, that uses the government's power to carry out its agenda. But within the Black church, we also have hierarchy. And so this is why the Syrophoenician woman, and within the movement, we have hierarchy, right? If we want to talk about what's happening recently, we have a lot of talk about George Floyd's death, but we are hearing less about Breonna Taylor's death. And Breonna Taylor was killed by the police when they stormed into her home unannounced with a no-knock warrant, and they killed her while she slept in her bed. And the conversation around Breonna Taylor started to die down, if we can be very honest. We didn't hear a lot about her. It started to die down and has been reignited now that we are also having to grapple with George Floyd's death at the hand of police. But what we're hearing less about are, and so much so that honestly, well, one, I have pulled myself somewhat away from what's happening and just the media, but I want to pull it up because I don't want to not say this brother's name. So much so that there was a trans brother who was also killed by the police. Thank you, Tony. Yes, Tony. Oh goodness, Tony McDade. Thank you. Tony McDade was killed by the police in Tallahassee, and we are hearing very little about him. Mm-hmm. And I don't take it that it's a coincidence that Tony McDade is a trans brother who was killed by the police. The movement is quiet when it's women who are killed. We see it even in our protest signs. When does my son become a threat? I have a Black son and I love him. Don't kill my son. Someone help my son. If you see my son pulled over by the police, stop and make sure he gets home alive. We're not talking about our children, right? Like, why is this a gendered fight? Why have we decided that the police only kill Black men, and not just only Black men, but cis hetero Black men are the people we have decided are worth our fight as a community. And that is where the Syrophoenician woman is, to me, the model of where we need to be like Jesus as well. Jesus, the Syrophoenician woman came and said, Jesus, help my daughter. She's sick, she's dying. And Jesus was like, I'm on vacation and you a Syrophoenician woman, you a dog. Like, I don't help dogs. Like, I came to give my bread to the real people. And you ain't like, who are you that you would come with the audacity to ask that I do something for you? And she was like, well, like, and this is where, I've been told that I have a smart mouth and a slick comeback for everything. And I was like, slick comeback save lives, right? Smart mouth saves lives. The Syrophoenician woman said, well, even the dogs get the crumbs from the master's table.
And they sure do. My dog gets every crumb that I drop. I say he catches it before it hits the ground. He just knows it's there.
And Jesus said, okay, woman, you know what? You are like, your daughter is healed. Your faith has made her well, like your faith. And people like to spiritualize this and say, oh, well, Jesus was just testing her, or like whatever. Like, he wanted to make sure, like, make her be persistent in her asking. And no, Jesus called that woman a dog, y'all. Like, Jesus was being classist, sexist, like, all in that moment. There was, and it comes to what is, when we take it back to what we are doing now, what we're pushing for now, what we're asking for now, which is life for all of us, but we can only seem to focus on when our cis men are killed and focusing on needing to save our sons and focusing on, my Black men are not a threat. Like, I saw a sign, somebody made a new sign, a man was lynched by the police today, or yesterday rather, and it was a new one, right? We have that old picture from the 60s where a man was lynched, but somebody had sewn a new one and it said a man was lynched. And when do we get past men being lynched and realize that Black people are being killed? The police are not looking. They don't care if it's a man or a woman. if they're cis or trans, if they're gay, if they're lesbian, if they're bisexual. The police don't care. They're killing us.
Mm-hmm.
When is the movement going to keep up? And what really bothers me about the movement that we have is that we use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, but of the 3 people who started this current movement using that phrasing, 2 of them are they're queer. We have, like, we're taking and co-opting the language that was created by queer women fighting for the lives of Black people, and decided that we are only going to talk about Black men. And that is something we need to push our own thinking about. Who are we only giving crumbs to in this movement?
That's good. That's good. Where can the people find you online?
Who?
Or do you not want the people? It's okay if you don't want the people to find you online.
So I am on Twitter and on Instagram at Courtney MT _. You can follow me on Twitter, but you can't follow me on Instagram, y'all.
Verdell.
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at v.w. It's the letter V, the DOT, and the letter W. You can follow me there on Twitter. I share stuff there sporadically. That's the only place that's actually even worth following me on anyway. So
thank you for joining us today, guys, for the Real Drunk Show. You can go to realdrunkshow.com, and that will link you to all the places that you can find our podcast, our social media, and these videos. And we will see you again soon, talking about something else that I have not decided yet. Have a great day. Bye.